Exactly 1 hour after I pushed our daughter into the world, I looked up from my hospital bed expecting my husband to cry tears of joy. Instead, he stared at the tiny swaddled blanket with absolute disgust, dropped a stack of legal papers on my lap, and said, "I already have a son with a woman who knows her place, so I refuse to acknowledge this child." I did not scream or beg. I simply smiled, looked him dead in the eyes, and whispered, "You need to remember this exact moment for the rest of your life." By the time the billing nurse walked in, his smug grin vanished completely. My name is Bianca, and I am 32 years old. Growing up bouncing between group homes and the foster care system in Atlanta taught me early on that the only person who will ever truly protect you is yourself. If you are watching this and have ever had a partner or a toxic family member mistake your silence for weakness, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will want to see exactly how I dismantled a dynasty brick by brick. The sterile smell of the medical center still clung to my skin. My body ached from 12 hours of grueling labor, but looking down at my beautiful newborn daughter Aria made every ounce of pain fade away. She had a full head of dark curls and tiny perfect fingers. I gently touched her cheek, feeling a surge of unconditional love I had craved my entire life. I looked up eagerly, waiting for Dion to share this profound milestone. We had been married for 5 years. 5 years of me playing the quiet and supportive wife to a man obsessed with his image. Dion owned a luxury car dealership in Buckhead, a business built heavily on flash debt and the illusion of generational wealth. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove the newest inventory, and made sure everyone in our social circle saw him as the ultimate provider. I was exhausted but happy, expecting him to finally soften. Instead, Dion stood near the door, checking his expensive watch. His jaw was clenched tight. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer me water or ask if I needed an extra blanket. He just walked over to the bed, pulled a thick manila envelope from his designer jacket, and tossed it onto the thin hospital mattress right next to Arya. My exhausted brain could not process what I was looking at immediately. I asked him what he was doing, my voice barely above a whisper. "Divorce papers," he said, his tone entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Sign them by Friday. I want you out of my house before the weekend." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. I told him he was scaring me and reminded him our daughter was just born. I asked him if he wanted to hold her. He physically recoiled, stepping back as if my child was contaminated. "A female child does absolutely nothing for my legacy, Bianca," he spat out. "I told you from day one that I needed a male heir to carry the family name to take over the dealership. A girl is useless to me. You failed to give me a son." His words hit me like physical blows, but the initial shock was quickly giving way to a cold and terrifying clarity. Legacy. He was talking about a car dealership drowning in massive business loans as if it were a royal throne. I pulled Arya closer to my chest, instinctively shielding her from the toxic energy radiating from the man who was supposed to protect us both. Before I could formulate a proper response, the heavy wooden door to my room swung wide open. The scent of an overpowering floral perfume flooded the sterile hospital air. My mother-in-law, Ruby, strutted into the room carrying a quilted designer bag and wearing a massive church hat that could rival a satellite dish. She never missed a Sunday service and loved to preach to the congregation about grace and humility, but her heart was as cold as winter. Right behind her walked Brittany, a 24-year-old girl I immediately recognized as the former receptionist from Dion's dealership. Brittany was holding a toddler, a boy around 2 years old, dressed in a miniature suit that perfectly matched Dion's outfit. The resemblance was deliberate and meant to be striking. Ruby did not even glance at the bassinet or her brand-new granddaughter. She marched straight to the foot of my bed, crossing her arms with a look of supreme superiority. "I told Dion the day he brought you home that a foster kid with no pedigree could not give this family a proper heir." Ruby sneered, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Lord knows we tried to welcome you into our blessed family, Bianca, but blood will always tell. You simply do not have the proper breeding to carry our family legacy forward. Brittany smirked, adjusting the toddler on her hip. The little boy reached out his arms, calling Dion his daddy. Dion smiled brightly, kissing the boy's forehead before wrapping a protective arm around Brittany's waist. "Brittany gave us a boy," Ruby announced loudly, making sure the nurses passing by in the hallway could hear her grand declaration. "She knows her place, and she knows how to serve a man. Now we expect you to sign the house over immediately, Bianca. Consider it back pay for Dion putting a roof over your head and elevating you from your pathetic background. We are reclaiming our family assets today." I sat there in the hospital bed listening to this woman who claimed to walk with the Lord demand that I surrender my home mere hours after giving birth. They had planned this entire ambush. For 2 whole years, my husband had been raising a child with his former receptionist, while sleeping in my bed, while promising me a family, while letting his mother treat me like a desperate charity case. I asked him if he really brought his mistress and his secret child to the maternity ward, my voice sounding eerily calm even to my own ears. Dion rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed that I was not breaking down into hysterical tears like he had anticipated. "Do not try to play the victim, Bianca," he warned me. "You knew I needed a son. You should be thanking me for letting you live in luxury for 5 years instead of complaining. Now it is time for you to return to whatever gutter the state pulled you out of. You have no family to run to. You have no support system to fall back on. You are completely alone." My mother-in-law clucked her tongue, shaking her head in a theatrical display of mock sympathy. "Bless your heart, Bianca," she murmured. "You really thought you could trap my successful son with a little girl? You need to pack whatever cheap clothes you brought with you and figure out your own transportation home." Dion is taking Brittany and Trey to a celebratory dinner at a steakhouse to celebrate his real heir. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost mesmerizing to witness. They were trying to break me mentally to strip away my dignity so I would quietly sign away my legal rights and disappear into the night. They thought because I never bragged about my career, because I kept a low profile to let Dion shine brightly in his social circles, that I was financially dependent on his fragile empire. Dion pulled out his phone, scrolling with a bored and arrogant expression. "By the way, I just called Human Resources and removed you from my health insurance policy. Effective midnight last night," he stated. "The hospital is going to process this delivery as an out-of-pocket expense. You have no job, no family, and no coverage. Good luck dealing with the $45,000 delivery bill." They fully expected me to panic. They wanted me to beg them for help. They wanted the ultimate satisfaction of watching the poor foster kids scramble for pennies. What none of them knew was that my silence during our entire marriage was not submission. It was careful observation. My actual job as a senior partner at a massive venture capital firm meant I spent my days analyzing, tearing apart, and liquidating fraudulent companies. I specialized in financial forensics. I knew exactly how to dismantle a liar piece by piece. I simply adjusted my hospital gown, made sure Arya was comfortably asleep against my chest, and offered Dion a chilling smile. I asked him to confirm that he canceled my health insurance while I was in labor. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive lapels. "I did," he confirmed proudly. "You are no longer my financial responsibility. Now sign the divorce papers. Sign the deed to the house, and maybe I will spot you a cab ride to a local homeless shelter." Ruby nodded in agreement, placing a manicured hand on Dion's shoulder. "The Lord provides for the righteous, Bianca," she preached. "You reap exactly what you sow." The timing of the universe could not have been more perfect. A young billing nurse walked into the room holding a clipboard and looking incredibly uncomfortable by the thick tension radiating in the air. "Excuse me, Ms. Bianca," the nurse said softly, avoiding eye contact with my husband. "I am so sorry to interrupt your recovery, but the insurance provider listed on your file just kicked back an error code stating the policy was terminated abruptly. The current balance for the labor delivery and postpartum care is $45,000. We need a valid card on file to proceed with your discharge processing." Dion crossed his arms, looking down at me with triumphant malice. Brittany snickered behind her hand, acting like she had just won a grand prize. Ruby actually checked her reflection in the room's mirror, completely unbothered by the sheer cruelty unfolding around her. "Well?" Bianca Dion mocked, his voice echoing loudly in the small room. "You better figure out how you are going to pay the lady before they call security on you." I did not break eye contact with my husband. I slowly reached over to the bedside table where my heavy leather tote bag sat. I unzipped the main compartment and deliberately bypassed the joint-checking debit card Dion monitored so closely. Instead, my fingers found a hidden zippered pocket inside the lining. I pulled out a heavy, solid black titanium Centurion card. The kind of credit card you cannot simply apply for online. The kind of card that requires a private invitation and a massive 8-figure net worth to even hold in your hand. I extended my arm and handed the heavy metal card directly to the nurse. "Put the entire 45,000 on this," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and commanding. "And please arrange for a private security escort to walk me and my newborn daughter to my car in 30 minutes. We have some unwanted trash lingering in this room, and I would like it removed immediately." The nurse looked down at the black card, her eyes widening in pure shock before nodding quickly. "Yes, ma'am, right away," she stuttered, rushing out of the door to process the payment. The color completely drained from Dion's face in an instant. His arrogant smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment and rising panic. Ruby stopped fixing her church hat, staring at the titanium card, as if it were a dangerous alien artifact. Brittany looked completely confused, not possessing the intelligence to understand the massive financial weight of what had just happened in front of her. "Where did you get that?" Dion demanded, his voice cracking as his carefully constructed illusion of power shattered into pieces. I looked down at my peacefully sleeping daughter, gently kissing her warm forehead, before looking back at the man who was about to lose absolutely everything he held dear. "That is none of your business," I replied calmly. "But since we are finally talking about real assets, you might want to check the current status of your dealership loans. You have a very busy weekend ahead of you, Dion. An elegant plan executed flawlessly leaves no room for error." I sat at my desk and let the reality of the medical report settle into my mind. Complete, irreversible sterility. Dion had known for 5 years that he could never father a child. He had watched me inject hormones into my stomach, endure invasive procedures, and cry myself to sleep month after month, believing I was the reason we could not conceive. He had held my hand in the fertility clinic, acting the part of the supportive husband, all while knowing his own biology was the broken link in our marriage. And yet less than 5 hours ago, he had stood over my hospital bed and proudly claimed Brittany's 2-year-old son as his own flesh and blood. He had weaponized a child against me, a child that could not possibly share a single drop of his DNA. The silence of my penthouse was only broken by the soft breathing of Arya sleeping in her bassinet across the room. I looked at my daughter, the miracle I had carried and delivered despite the odds. She was my only family now, and I was going to ensure no one from that toxic bloodline ever came near her again. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the direct line for Marcus, who also handled my private security arrangements. He answered on the first ring. I told him I needed a full surveillance package deployed immediately. I wanted eyes on Preston and Brittany, 24 hours a day. I wanted every movement tracked, every location logged, and every interaction documented. I explained that I was looking for a pattern of overlapping schedules, specifically when Dion and Ebony were occupied elsewhere. Marcus confirmed the orders without asking questions. He knew my methods, and he knew my resources. Over the next few days, my penthouse became a war room. I did not leave the apartment, focusing entirely on Arya and the systematic destruction of Dion's financial infrastructure. By Tuesday morning, the panic had set in deeply across his network. My automated insolvency notices had triggered a massive domino effect. The primary inventory suppliers for his luxury car dealership halted all shipments and dispatched recovery teams to reclaim the vehicles currently sitting on his showroom floor. His payroll accounts remained frozen, leaving his entire sales staff without their commissions, resulting in a mass walkout. Dion was trapped in a sinking ship, and the water was rising faster than he could bail it out. I was reviewing the latest commercial lien filings when the building concierge called my secure line. Ms. Bianca, the concierge said, his voice tight with professional tension. There is a woman in the lobby demanding to see you. She claims she is your sister-in-law and says it is a dire family emergency. She is making quite a scene and threatening to call the press if we do not grant her access. I checked the lobby security cameras through my monitor. Ebony was pacing back and forth across the marble floor, clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. Her hair was a mess, and her usually flawless makeup looked rushed. She was desperate. "Send her up," I instructed, "but have security escort her directly to the private meeting room on my floor. Do not let her near my personal residence doors." I locked my office and walked down the hallway to the neutral meeting space I maintained for corporate guests. It was a sterile room with a glass table and stark lighting designed to offer zero comfort. I sat at the head of the table and waited. The doors opened, and a security guard ushered Ebony inside. She looked around the opulent space, her eyes widening as she took in the sheer wealth surrounding her. The narrative she had believed her entire life, that I was a poor foster kid, living off her brother's charity, crumbled instantly in the face of this reality. She rushed toward this table, her voice cracking as she launched into her rehearsed plea. "Bianca, please, you have to stop this," she cried, gripping the edge of the glass table. "Dion is losing everything. The bank is foreclosing on the dealership, and Preston's law firm just slashed his salary because of the public scandal regarding the frozen accounts. We are going broke, Bianca. You cannot do this to your own family." I sat perfectly still, letting her tears fall, without offering a single word of comfort. I analyzed her desperation, noting how quickly her arrogance had evaporated when her financial security was threatened. I asked her why she thought Dion's debts were my responsibility. "Because you are his wife," Ebony pleaded, leaning closer. "You have all this money. You have been hiding all this wealth while my brother struggled to provide for everyone. You owe it to this family to fix this. My mother is having a nervous breakdown, and Preston is so stressed he barely comes home anymore." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the cool glass. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every word carried the weight of a physical blow. "You might want to stop worrying about my money, Ebony," I said smoothly, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "And you might want to start worrying about Preston's Friday afternoon golf games." Ebony blinked, her tears momentarily stalling as confusion replaced her panic. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. I tilted my head, studying her naive expression. "Have you ever wondered why your husband comes home from the country club smelling like Victoria's Secret perfume instead of freshly cut grass?" I asked, dropping the breadcrumbs exactly where I wanted them. "Have you ever checked his credit card statements to see who pays for the hotel rooms downtown on the days he claims to be working late on a big case?" Ebony stood up straight, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You are lying," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are just trying to hurt us because Dion left you. Preston loves me. He would never betray our family." I smiled, a cold, empty smile. I told her to ask Preston about his favorite room at the Mandarin Oriental. I told her to ask him why he bought a diamond tennis bracelet last month that never made its way onto her wrist. "Get out of my building, Ebony," I commanded, dropping the polite facade entirely. "And tell your mother that if she ever speaks my name again, I will personally see to it that the IRS audits the church building fund she oversees. I know exactly where she got the cash to help Dion make his last mortgage payment." Ebony backed away from the table, stumbling slightly in her designer heels. She turned and fled from the room, the heavy doors closing behind her with a definitive thud. I knew she would confront Preston. The seed of doubt was planted, and it would grow rapidly in the toxic soil of their marriage. The next afternoon, my security detail alerted me to a situation at a high-end restaurant in Buckhead. I had scheduled a working lunch with a prospective tech founder looking for venture capital funding. It was a public space, and Dion had somehow tracked my location. I was sitting in a private alcove discussing term sheets when Dion stormed past the hostess desk. He looked unhinged. His custom suit was wrinkled, and he had clearly not slept in days. He marched directly to my table, slamming his hands down on the linen tablecloth and startling my guest. "You think you are so smart?" Bianca Dion snarled, leaning over me in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. You think freezing my accounts makes you powerful. I am taking Arya. I am filing for full emergency custody. I will tell a judge you are mentally unstable and unfit to mother. I will drag your name through the mud until you sign a waiver releasing my business from your holding company. My guest looked terrified, slowly pushing his chair away from the table. I did not flinch. I calmly picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, ignoring the aggressive posture of the man hovering over me. I asked Dion if he really wanted to discuss legal custody in a crowded restaurant. He laughed, a harsh, manic sound that drew the attention of several nearby diners. I am going to ruin you, he threatened, his voice echoing off the restaurant walls. You are nothing but a bitter ex trying to destroy my legacy. But you failed. I am hosting a massive high society gala this weekend at the Grand Hotel. I am securing new investors, and I am saving my empire. A major venture capital firm has already confirmed their attendance, and when they see my pitch, they are going to fund my entire expansion. He stood up straight, adjusting his wrinkled lapels, playing to the audience of silent diners watching our table. You are history, Bianca, he declared loudly. My real family is moving forward without you. I set my water glass down carefully, making sure not to spill a single drop. I looked up at the desperate, pathetic man who thought he had outsmarted the system. He was hosting a gala to save his dealership by pitching to a major venture capital firm. I simply nodded, acknowledging his grand declaration. I told him I looked forward to seeing his presentation. Dion scoffed, turning on his heel and marching out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of whispered gossip behind him. He thought he had asserted dominance. He thought he had proven his resilience. He had no idea that I was the anonymous venture capital firm that had confirmed attendance to his desperate gala. I had accepted the invitation through a subsidiary holding company, setting the stage for the most public execution of a fraud in Atlanta history. I apologized to my guest for the interruption and resumed our discussion about term sheets perfectly calm. The trap was set, and Dion was running headfirst right into the jaws of his own destruction. I drove away from this sprawling suburban estate without a single glance in the rearview mirror, leaving the chaotic mess of my former life behind me. My private driver navigated the heavy Atlanta traffic with practiced ease while I sat in the spacious back seat of the black car, holding my newborn daughter Arya close to my chest. The tinted windows shielded us from the harsh afternoon sun, creating a quiet sanctuary as we headed downtown. I was not retreating. I was repositioning. When I first married Dayon, he insisted we live in that gaudy 6-bedroom house in the suburbs because he desperately needed his neighbors and business rivals to see his massive columns and perfectly manicured lawns. He was a man utterly consumed by the illusion of generational wealth. I, on the other hand, preferred the untouchable security of the sky. My driver pulled into the subterranean parking garage of the most exclusive high-rise building in the city. I owned a multi-million-dollar penthouse on the top floor, a property I purchased in cash long before I ever put on a wedding dress. I kept it a complete secret, renting it occasionally to visiting corporate executives, but primarily using it as my personal fortress. The private elevator recognized my biometric scan and whisked us silently up to the roof. The doors opened directly into my foyer, revealing immaculate marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. I handed my sleeping baby to the private neonatal nurse I had hired earlier that morning. She gently took Arya and walked toward the custom nursery I had prepared months ago just in case my foster care survival instincts were right about my marriage. Once I was completely alone, I walked down the long hallway and unlocked the heavy doors to my home office. It was not a typical residential study. It was a fully equipped venture capital command center, featuring a bank of 6 curved monitors, encrypted servers, and direct access to global financial databases. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, booted up my systems, and cracked my knuckles. I did not feel sad. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt a cold, razor-sharp focus that had kept me alive on the streets as a child and made me a billionaire in the boardroom as an adult. On my center monitor, I pulled up the real-time transaction logs for Dion Luxury Car Dealership. The freeze I had placed on his corporate accounts through my holding company was absolute. I watched the digital alerts light up my screen in a cascading waterfall of red failure notices as his automated payments bounced one by one. The dealership utility bills were rejected. His vendor payments failed. The most satisfying alert flashed across my screen when his weekly payroll processing was denied due to insufficient and frozen funds. It was Friday afternoon. His entire sales team, his mechanics, and his administration staff were expecting their direct deposits to hit their bank accounts. Instead, they were getting absolutely nothing. My secure phone began to vibrate continuously. I had forwarded all my old voicemails to a cloud server so I could listen to them without engaging him directly. Dion was rapidly unraveling. The first few messages were full of arrogant threats and aggressive posturing. He demanded I reverse the hold immediately. He yelled that I was going to federal prison for interfering with his legitimate business operations. But by the fourth voicemail, the arrogant facade had completely cracked, revealing the sheer panic sweating underneath. He was practically begging me to release just enough capital to pay his staff. He told me his top-performing salesmen were walking off the lot and threatening to sue him for wage theft. He said his high-end inventory suppliers were calling his personal cell phone demanding their cars back. I listened to his voice crack and tremble, and I felt no pity. I knew Dion would not go down without desperately searching for a bailout. He had spent his entire life running to his mother whenever his poor choices finally caught up with him. Ruby had always treated him like a golden god who could do no wrong. I opened a new search window and began tracking the routing numbers associated with his personal checking account. I did not have to wait long. Just before the banks closed for the weekend, a massive wire transfer hit his personal account. It was for $250,000. It was just enough to cover his immediate payroll and stave off the angry vendors for a few days. I engaged my tracing software to follow the origin of the wire transfer, pulling it back through several routing nodes until I found the original source. I had to laugh at the sheer breathtaking hypocrisy of it all. Ruby had secretly taken out a second mortgage on her modest brick home, draining every single ounce of equity she had left to her name. But that was only half the money. The other half came from a corporate account registered to the Regional Holy Redeemer Church. Ruby was the head of the church finance committee. She had spent the morning preaching to me about righteousness and reaping what I sow, while she was simultaneously embezzling over $100,000 from the church orphanage fund to save her cheating son. She was risking federal prison just to protect Dion and his new fake family. She was that desperate to secure the future of the grandson she valued so much more than my daughter. I downloaded the wire transfer receipts, the mortgage documents, and the church account ledgers. I saved them all to a heavily encrypted hard drive. Ruby had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her social standing permanently. With Ruby providing a temporary bailout that would only delay Dion from facing immediate bankruptcy, I decided to dig deeper into the actual foundation of his dealership. I had always kept my professional finances completely separate from our marriage, but I knew Dion had taken out massive commercial loans to build his flashy showroom and acquire his luxury inventory. I used my venture capital credentials to pull the original loan origination documents from the underwriting banks. I needed to see exactly how leveraged he truly was. The documents downloaded to my screen in hundreds of scanned pages. I scrolled through the corporate structuring, the inventory collateral agreements, and the personal guarantees. That was when my eyes locked onto something impossible. At the bottom of a $10 million commercial liability agreement, there was a signature line for the primary guarantor. It was my name. Bianca, holding a pen stroke that looked remarkably similar to my own, but lacked the sharp, angled pressure I always used on the first letter. I froze staring at the digital ink. Dion had not just built his company on debt. He had built his entire empire using my name, my pristine credit score, and my phantom financial backing without my knowledge. I pulled up 5 other major loan documents. My forged signature was on every single one of them, and the notary stamp next to my fake signature belonged to none other than Preston, his arrogant brother-in-law. For years, they had been fraudulently binding me to his reckless financial behavior. He needed the illusion of a wealthy wife to secure the massive capital required to play the role of the big-shot boss. The betrayal was staggering. He had brought his mistress and his illegitimate son to my hospital bed, demanding I sign over my house, all while knowing he had already committed massive corporate fraud using my identity. But his arrogance was his ultimate downfall. By forging my name as the primary financial guarantor, he had inadvertently given me absolute legal ownership over his entire debt structure. I was not just a disgruntled wife going through a messy divorce. In the eyes of the global banking system, I was the senior stakeholder. I owned his debts, I owned his inventory, I owned him entirely. I spent the next 3 days barricaded in my office, surviving on black coffee and pure adrenaline. The neonatal nurse took wonderful care of Arya, bringing her to me for feedings, while I continued to build an impenetrable cage around my soon-to-be ex-husband. I wanted to know where every single dollar had gone during our 5-year marriage. I combed through thousands of credit card transactions, bank statements, and travel expenses. I tracked the expensive dinners he bought for Brittany. I tracked the lavish gifts he purchased for his mother. But as I was cross-referencing an old joint account we used for tax purposes, I found a strange anomaly. It was a random charge from 5 years ago, right around the time we first got married and started discussing having children. It was a billing code for a small private medical clinic located 3 states away in Florida. The charge was for $8,000 paid in full, from an account Dion thought he had hidden from me. It was strange because Dion was obsessed with his local concierge doctors and never traveled for medical care. He especially would not go to a modest strip mall clinic in Florida. I used my deep network to bypass the standard medical privacy firewalls. I hired a private data retrieval firm operating out of Eastern Europe, paying them handsomely to dig into the clinic archives and pull the exact patient file associated with that billing date. It took them less than 12 hours to crack the database and send the encrypted file directly to my secure server. The document was a single-page file. I opened it and zoomed in on the header. It was a comprehensive urology report outlining the results of a specialized surgical procedure. I read through the clinical jargon, the post-operative notes, and the final physician summary. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, just to make absolutely sure my exhausted eyes were not deceiving me. The report detailed a severe medical condition that required emergency intervention, resulting in permanent damage to his reproductive system. I moved my cursor and drew a bright red digital circle around one specific line at the very bottom of the page. The physician had clearly written patient diagnosed with complete irreversible sterility. I sat back in my leather chair, the silence of the penthouse ringing loudly in my ears. Complete irreversible sterility. Dion could not have children. He had known this for 5 years. He had sat beside me in fertility clinics, watching me endure painful hormone injections, blaming myself for our inability to conceive a child, all while knowing he was physically incapable of being a father. But more importantly, he could not possibly be the biological father of Brittany, 2-year-old son. I looked at my secondary monitor, where I had pulled up a social media photo of Brittany holding the little boy Trey. The child had light brown eyes and a very distinct jawline. Dion was currently destroying his entire life, ruining his marriage, committing massive financial fraud, and letting his mother steal from a church, all to protect a male heir that did not even belong to him. The sheer magnitude of his delusion was almost beautiful to witness. He wanted a legacy so badly that he was willing to accept a stolen child just to prove his manhood to the world. He wanted to parade a son around his luxury dealership and brag to his arrogant friends about his strong bloodline. Now I held the absolute proof that his bloodline ended with him. I thought about Preston, the arrogant lawyer who had stood on my porch and threatened me. Preston, who notarized the forged loan documents. Preston, who had always looked at Brittany with a strange, lingering gaze at family dinners. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, revealing a picture so twisted and depraved that it was almost hard to believe. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands, and smiled. It was a wicked, terrible smile that promised absolute ruin for everyone involved. The dominoes were perfectly lined up, and I was finally ready to push the first one over. The days leading up to the gala were a masterclass in silent preparation. I operated from my penthouse command center, directing my security team and my financial analysts with absolute precision. Every piece of information I gathered was meticulously verified and securely stored. The medical report proving Dion's complete irreversible sterility was locked in a digital vault alongside the evidence of his massive corporate fraud. The forged loan documents, the embezzled church funds, and the routing numbers for his hidden accounts were all neatly organized into a presentation that would soon be seen by the most powerful people in the city. My private investigator Marcus requested an in-person meeting late Thursday evening. I instructed security to bring him up to the penthouse. He arrived carrying a thick manila envelope and a small encrypted flash drive. Marcus was a former intelligence officer who rarely showed emotion, but tonight there was a distinct look of satisfaction on his face. He handed me the envelope without a word and stood back while I opened it. Inside were dozens of high-resolution photographs. I spread them out across my glass desk, studying the images carefully. They were pictures of Preston and Brittany. The arrogant white corporate defense attorney and my husband's young mistress were captured in vivid detail. The photos showed them slipping into the side entrance of a boutique hotel downtown. There were images of them sitting in a dimly lit corner of an upscale lounge, leaning close and whispering to each other. The most damning photographs showed them kissing passionately in the shadows of a parking garage. They had been carrying on an affair for 3 years, right under Dion's nose. Marcus pointed to the flash drive resting on my desk. The drive contains the digital copies and the timestamps. He explained, his voice low and professional. I tracked their movements for the past 72 hours just as you requested. They met twice this week while your sister-in-law Ebony was attending her charity board meetings and while Dion was frantically trying to secure vendors for his gala. They are careless and arrogant. They think no one is paying attention. I looked at the photos of the man who had stood on my porch and threatened me with his law degree. Preston had believed his race and his status made him untouchable. He thought he could intimidate a black single mother and steal her property while secretly sleeping with her husband's mistress. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. I thanked Marcus for his excellent work and authorized a substantial bonus to his account. The next morning, I needed to secure the final biological component of my trap. I could not simply rely on photographs to destroy Dion's illusion of a legacy. I needed absolute, indisputable scientific proof. I needed DNA. I reviewed the tracking data Marcus had provided and noted a distinct pattern in Preston's daily routine. Every Friday morning, he stopped at a specific high-end cafe near his law firm to order a custom espresso before heading into the office. I dressed carefully for the occasion, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that screamed quiet wealth. I left Arya with the neonatal nurse and had my driver take me to the financial district. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes before Preston's usual arrival time. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a small table near the counter, positioning myself perfectly. Preston walked through the doors exactly on schedule. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit and carrying his expensive leather briefcase. He looked every bit the entitled partner of a major law firm. He did not notice me at first, as he stepped up to the counter to place his order. The real surprise came a moment later, when the cafe doors opened again and Brittany walked in. She was pushing a stroller with 2-year-old Trey sitting inside. They had obviously planned a brief morning rendezvous before starting their day. Brittany smiled brightly at Preston, acting like they were just two friendly acquaintances bumping into each other by chance. Preston played along perfectly, offering a polite greeting while keeping a professional distance in the crowded cafe. They stood near the pickup counter waiting for their drinks. Trey was fussing in his stroller, dropping a small plastic spoon onto the floor. Brittany picked it up, wiped it off casually, and handed it back to the toddler, who immediately put it into his mouth. I stood up from my table and walked directly toward them. I timed my approach perfectly, stepping right into their personal space just as the barista called Preston's name. Preston turned around, his hand reaching for his coffee cup, and nearly collided with me. His arrogant expression quickly shifted into a sneer of absolute disdain when he recognized who I was. "Bianca," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What a tragic surprise! I thought you would be busy packing your cheap bags by now. I understand Dion is preparing to finalize the eviction papers on Monday." Brittany stood beside him, holding her own coffee cup and looking at me with a mixture of fear and smug satisfaction. She thought she had won the grand prize. She thought she was the mother of the heir apparent. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of anger. I looked Preston up and down, taking in his expensive suit and his arrogant posture. I told him he should be very careful about making legal threats in public spaces, especially when his own firm was currently investigating his billing hours. Preston's face flushed dark red. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He told me I was out of my depth. He said I was nothing but a bitter foster kid trying to play games with people who owned the city. He threatened to file a massive defamation suit against me if I dared to speak about him or his law firm ever again. He pointed his finger at my chest, emphasizing every arrogant word. I simply smiled, looking directly into his angry eyes. I stepped forward, invading his space, and casually bumped my shoulder hard against his arm. The sudden impact caused his hand to jerk violently. The hot espresso spilled out of his cup, splashing down the front of his pristine white shirt and staining his expensive silk tie. Preston cursed loudly, dropping the empty paper cup onto the floor. He frantically grabbed napkins from the counter, trying to dab at the spreading brown stain on his chest. Brittany gasped, reaching out to help him, but quickly pulled her hand back, remembering they were supposed to be in public. I offered a soft, insincere apology for my clumsiness. While Preston was distracted, cursing and wiping his shirt, I smoothly reached down to the floor. My movements were practiced and invisible to the chaotic scene. I picked up Preston's discarded coffee cup, grabbing it carefully by the base to preserve the saliva on the rim. In the same fluid motion, I reached into the stroller and swiftly pulled the small plastic spoon right out of Trey's mouth. Brittany was too busy staring at Preston's ruined suit to notice what I had done. Trey let out a brief, confused whine, but I had already slipped the cup and the spoon into a sterile plastic evidence bag hidden inside my large tote. I looked at Preston, who was still furiously scrubbing his tie. I told him he really should not wear white if he could not handle a little mess. I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving them to deal with the public embarrassment. I got into my waiting car and immediately handed the sealed plastic bag to Marcus, who was sitting in the front passenger seat. "Take this directly to the expedited testing lab," I ordered, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I paid for the 24-hour premium rush service. I want those results delivered to my desk by tomorrow evening. I want a certified chain of custody and a legally binding document proving exactly who fathered that child." Marcus nodded, taking the evidence bag and securing it in a lockbox. "Consider it done, Mrs. Bianca." I rode back to my penthouse, feeling a profound sense of calm. The pieces were all finally in place. The trap was fully constructed, and the bait had been taken. Dion thought he was hosting a gala to save his fraudulent empire. He thought he was going to stand on a stage and present his fake son to the world as his ultimate legacy. He had no idea that he was simply building the very scaffold from which his entire life would hang. Saturday evening arrived with a quiet intensity. The penthouse was completely silent, except for the soft, classical music playing in my dressing room. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, studying my reflection. I was not dressing for a party. I was dressing for a public execution. I slipped into a custom $15,000 Balmain gown. It was a deep midnight blue structured with sharp architectural lines that projected absolute power and authority. It was armor disguised as haute couture. I secured a simple diamond necklace around my throat and stepped into a pair of stiletto heels that echoed sharply against the marble floors. My secure phone chimed, indicating an incoming message from the downstairs lobby. The courier from the testing lab had arrived. I instructed the concierge to send him up immediately. 5 minutes later, the heavy doors to my office opened and Marcus walked in, holding a sealed manila envelope bearing the official stamp of the genetic testing facility. He handed the envelope to me without a single word. The silence in the room was absolute. I broke the seal and pulled out the thick stack of laboratory documents. I bypassed the methodology reports and the sequence charts, flipping straight to the final page where the conclusive summary was printed in bold black text. I read the final line and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. The DNA from the coffee cup perfectly matched the DNA from the plastic spoon. Trey was Preston's son, the golden heir to the dealership dynasty. The child that Dion had used to humiliate me and demand my house was nothing more than the product of a cheap 3-year affair between a racist lawyer and an opportunistic receptionist. Dion's entire legacy was a biological lie. I carefully slid the certified DNA results back into the manila envelope and placed it inside my evening clutch alongside the medical report detailing Dion's irreversible sterility and the financial documents proving his massive corporate fraud. I picked up my clutch and walked out to the private elevator. My security detail was waiting for me in the underground garage. 3 large black SUVs were lined up, their engines idling quietly in the dark. I stepped into the back of the lead vehicle and gave the order to move out. We drove through the city streets, heading directly toward the Grand Hotel where Dion was currently hosting his desperate masquerade. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, feeling absolutely no remorse for what was about to happen. Dion had told me to remember the moment he refused to hold our daughter. He had wanted me to feel the crushing weight of his rejection. Tonight, I was going to make sure he remembered my name for the rest of his miserable life. The subterranean parking garage of my building was a fortress of concrete and shadows. I stood in the designated loading bay, my breath pluming slightly in the damp air. I was not wearing my usual corporate armor, but rather a simple, dark trench coat and sunglasses that obscured my identity. The silence of the underground structure was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation fans. I checked my secure phone, waiting for the encrypted signal to arrive. Marcus was a ghost in the physical world, an independent private investigator who operated with a terrifying level of efficiency. I paid him a small fortune to exist solely in the shadows and execute my directives without question. A sleek black sedan rounded the concrete corner, its headlights cutting through the dim garage. The car rolled silently to a stop exactly 5 feet from where I stood. The driver's side door opened and Marcus stepped out. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with the rigid posture of a former intelligence officer. He did not smile or offer a polite greeting. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a thick manila envelope and a small silver flash drive. He handed the items to me, his expression completely blank. He told me the digital files on the drive contained the raw metadata and timestamps, while the envelope held the high-resolution physical prints. He said the subjects were remarkably careless and practically performed for the camera. I took the heavy envelope, feeling the weight of absolute destruction in my hands. I unclasped the metal closure and slid the photographs out into the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage. I stared at the top image, my heart remaining completely steady. It was a crystal-clear photograph of Preston and Brittany. They were standing in the lavishly decorated lobby of the Four Seasons Hotel. Preston was wearing his signature arrogant smirk, his hands resting aggressively on Brittany's waist. She was looking up at him with a sickeningly devoted expression, her hands tangled in the lapels of his expensive suit. I flipped to the next photograph. It was a close-up shot of them kissing passionately in the shadows near the elevator bank. Their bodies were pressed tightly together, projecting a level of intimacy that went far beyond a casual indiscretion. I sifted through the rest of the images documenting their timeline. They were meeting at upscale restaurants, slipping into private hotel suites, and sharing quiet moments in deserted parking structures. The betrayal was profound and pathetic. Preston, the arrogant racist lawyer who judged me for my background, was carrying on a sordid affair with his brother-in-law's cheap mistress. I slid the photos back into the envelope and asked Marcus if he had established their weekly patterns. He nodded, stating they had a very predictable routine. He explained that every Thursday morning, Preston visited a specific high-end cafe in Buckhead to purchase an overpriced espresso before heading to his law firm. He added that Brittany frequently orchestrated her morning walks with the toddler to casually intercept him at that exact location. They used the bustling coffee shop as a cover for their reckless public flirtation. I thanked Marcus and told him to remain on standby. The first phase of my retaliation required absolute biological proof, and I knew exactly how I was going to acquire it. Thursday morning arrived with a crisp bite to the air. I left Arya sleeping peacefully in her luxury nursery under the careful watch of her private nurse. I instructed my driver to take me directly to Buckhead. I dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and dark slacks, projecting an aura of quiet, untouchable authority. I walked into the crowded artisanal cafe 15 minutes before Preston was scheduled to arrive. The air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and expensive pastries. The room buzzed with the obnoxious chatter of corporate executives and wealthy socialites displaying their status. I selected a small table near the primary pickup counter, giving me a perfect unobstructed view of the entrance and the barista station. I ordered a sparkling water and sat completely still. I was a predator sitting patiently in the tall grass waiting for the trap to spring. Preston walked through the glass doors precisely on schedule. He looked incredibly arrogant, wearing a custom navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most people's cars. He marched directly to the front of the line, cutting off an older gentleman without a single word of apology. He ordered his complex espresso drink and stepped back, pulling out his phone with a bored expression. 5 minutes later, the cafe doors opened again and Brittany walked in. She was pushing Trey in a massive luxury stroller, her blonde hair perfectly styled for a casual morning stroll. She spotted Preston immediately, and her face lit up with a fabricated look of complete surprise. She rolled the stroller over to him, acting incredibly shocked to run into her brother-in-law. They exchanged a brief greeting that lingered just a second too long for polite family members. Preston leaned down and ruffled the toddler's hair, calling him a tough little guy. My stomach churned at the sheer audacity of their performance. Trey was fussing in his stroller, gripping a small blue plastic spoon covered in sticky fruit puree. He babbled happily, chewing on the handle of the spoon, while the two adults engaged in their quiet, intimate conversation. I watched the barista place a steaming paper cup on the counter, calling out Preston's name. Preston reached out and grabbed the coffee, taking a slow, deliberate sip from the plastic lid. He smiled at Brittany, telling her he had a massive deposition to prepare for and needed the caffeine to survive the morning. This was my window. I stood up from my table, gripping my heavy leather tote bag, and walked purposefully toward the counter. I timed my approach with absolute surgical perfection, stepping directly into Preston's blind spot just as he turned around to leave. I deliberately shifted my weight and forced a collision, making sure he absorbed the brunt of the impact. I stepped back quickly, feigning shock. Preston stumbled backward, his hand jerking upward in a desperate attempt to balance himself. Bianca, he snapped, his voice sharp and loud enough to draw the immediate attention of the surrounding customers. What the hell are you doing here, stalking me now because you are completely desperate? Brittany gasped, pulling the stroller slightly backward. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, clearly panicked that I had discovered their secret morning rendezvous. I did not back down. I looked Preston directly in his eyes, my expression entirely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told him he was standing in my way. Preston puffed out his chest, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. He leaned down, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me in front of the crowded cafe. "You have completely lost your mind, Bianca." He threatened, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I am drafting the defamation paperwork right now. You think you can freeze my brother-in-law's accounts and ruin our family business without facing legal consequences? I am going to bury you in litigation until you are begging for pennies on the street. I will make sure the judge sees exactly how unstable you truly are." I let him rant, absorbing his empty threats without blinking. He was a pathetic small man trying to project power he did not possess. I told him his legal threats were as weak as his golf swing. Preston sneered, taking another aggressive step toward me. "You are nothing but a trashy foster kid playing dress-up." He spat out the cruel words designed to break my spirit. "You never belonged in our family." I smiled, a slow, calculated smile. I told him it was a shame his expensive suit was about to be ruined. Before he could process my words, I smoothly knocked my heavy leather bag directly against his extended arm. The impact was swift and violent. The plastic lid popped off his cup, and the scalding hot espresso splashed directly onto the front of his pristine navy suit, soaking his silk tie and ruining his crisp white shirt. Preston shouted a string of vicious curses, dropping the empty paper cup onto the floor as he frantically grabbed for napkins from a nearby dispenser. The cafe erupted into quiet chaos as people turned to stare at the commotion. Brittany shrieked, abandoning the stroller to help Preston dab desperately at his ruined clothes. I moved with the speed and precision of a ghost. While Preston and Brittany were entirely consumed by the massive brown stains spreading across his chest, I smoothly reached down to the floor. I picked up the discarded coffee cup, handling it carefully by the very bottom edge to ensure I did not contaminate the saliva-soaked rim. In the exact same fluid motion, I reached my other hand into the stroller where Trey was sitting wide-eyed and confused. I gently pulled the sticky blue plastic spoon directly out of the toddler's mouth. He let out a soft whine of protest, but I had already reached into my purse and pulled out an identical clean spoon, swapping them instantly. I dropped the saliva-coated spoon and the discarded coffee cup into two separate sterile plastic evidence bags I had prepared earlier. I zipped my purse shut before anyone could even register what had happened. Preston was still furiously scrubbing at his chest, his face purple with absolute rage. "You crazy psycho!" he yelled, pointing a stained napkin at me. "I am calling the police!" I calmly adjusted my coat and looked down at him with supreme pity. I told him he should probably go home and change before he embarrassed himself any further. I turned around and walked out of the cafe, leaving them to deal with the humiliating public spectacle. Marcus was waiting in the idling black sedan parked just outside the cafe doors. I slid into the back seat and immediately handed him the two sealed plastic bags. My hands were perfectly steady. "I want these delivered to the expedited testing facility in Alpharetta. Immediately," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute weight of my authority. "I want a rush order, full DNA, panel cross-referencing the genetic markers on that cup against the saliva on that spoon. I do not care what it costs. I want the certified results in my hands by tonight." Marcus took the evidence bags, placing them securely in a lockbox. He nodded once, confirming the order, before directing the driver to pull away from the curb. The rest of the day moved in a blur of calculated anticipation. I returned to my downtown penthouse and finalized the financial destruction sequence I had built for Dion. I transferred his debt portfolios, authorized the final foreclosure notices, and prepared the press releases that would soon destroy his public reputation. I was completely, utterly ruthless in my execution. As the evening approached, the atmosphere in my penthouse shifted from clinical warfare to refined elegance. I walked into my massive dressing room and stood before the full-length mirrors. Tonight was the night Dion was hosting his desperate high society gala. He had spent his last borrowed pennies to rent out the grand ballroom at the St. Regis, inviting the wealthiest investors in the city to save his crumbling empire. He believed he was going to stand on a stage, present a brilliant business pitch, and walk away with millions in venture capital funding. I reached into my closet and pulled out the custom Balmain gown I had commissioned specifically for this evening. It was a masterpiece of midnight black velvet and sharp silver embellishments that looked like shimmering armor. It cost $15,000, and it fit my body with flawless, deadly precision. I stepped into the gown, feeling the heavy, luxurious fabric settle against my skin. I applied a deep red lipstick and secured a diamond choker around my neck. I looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield. Just as I was clasping the delicate strap of my stiletto heels, the heavy oak doors to my office swung open. Marcus walked into the room holding a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the official crest of the genetic testing laboratory. He had bypassed standard security protocols to bring it directly to my private quarters. He handed the envelope to me without a word. The silence in the room was absolute. I took a slow, deep breath and broke the heavy wax seal. I pulled out the crisp white laboratory report and scanned past the complex medical terminology, dropping my eyes straight to the final conclusive paragraph at the bottom of the page. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. A dark, wicked smile spread across my face, mirroring the cold reflection in the glass. The DNA on Preston's coffee cup perfectly matched the DNA on Trey's plastic spoon. Preston, the arrogant lawyer who notarized my forged signatures, was the biological father of his sister-in-law's child. The baby that Dion claimed as his ultimate legacy, the son he used to throw me away, was a product of absolute degenerate betrayal. I carefully folded the certified DNA report and slipped it into my sleek silver clutch alongside the medical file proving Dion's irreversible sterility and the financial documents detailing his massive corporate fraud. I had every single weapon I needed to destroy them all. I walked out to the private elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Dion was waiting at his gala, completely unaware that the major venture capital firm he was so desperately trying to impress was currently riding down in a private elevator wearing $15,000 worth of body armor. I was going to burn his entire world to the ground, and I was going to look absolutely stunning while doing it. The private elevator descended silently, carrying me down toward the grand ballroom of the hotel. The door slid open, revealing a scene that looked like a desperate man idea of high society. The room was bathed in the warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers, and a live string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne that I knew Dion could not actually afford. I stepped out of the elevator and stood in the shadowed archway of the entrance, letting my eyes adjust to the bright lights. The heavy midnight blue velvet of my Balmain gown brushed softly against the marble floor. I did not rush into the room. I stood perfectly still and simply watched the pathetic illusion unfolding in front of me. Dion was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of wealthy older men whom I recognized as local real estate developers and angel investors. He was wearing a ridiculous crushed velvet tuxedo that looked like it belonged in a cheap music video. His smile was too wide, and his laughter was too loud. He was sweating visibly under the chandeliers, his forehead glistening as he tried to project an image of absolute financial stability. He was gesturing wildly, trying to sell them a dream that was already completely bankrupt. Brittany was standing right beside him, wearing a gaudy sequined dress that clung tightly to her frame. She was holding little Trey on her hip. The toddler was dressed in a miniature tuxedo that perfectly matched Dion's outfit. It was a calculated prop designed to show these conservative investors that Dion was a dedicated family man, building a generational empire. She looked around the room with a sense of utter entitlement. She truly believed she had arrived. She thought this crowded ballroom was her coronation as the new queen of the dealership dynasty. I watched as Dion placed a heavy hand on the toddler's back and leaned in to speak to an older investor. I could hear his booming voice carrying over the string quartet. "This is the future of my empire right here, gentlemen," he bragged, puffing out his chest. "A man needs a strong son to pass his legacy down to. My boy Trey is going to inherit everything we are building tonight." Brittany beamed with pride, soaking up the polite nods from the wealthy men. Across the room, Ruby was holding court with a group of women from her church. She was wearing a massive silver hat that defied gravity and a matching dress that looked entirely out of place among the understated elegance of the real investors. She was waving her hands and preaching to anyone who would listen. "The Lord has blessed our family so abundantly," she proclaimed loudly. "My golden son is elevating us to new heights, and my beautiful new grandson is a true blessing from God." She was preening and posing, completely oblivious to the fact that she had committed federal wire fraud by draining the church building fund just to pay for the cheap champagne her friends were currently drinking. It was a masterpiece of collective delusion. They were all feeding off each other, dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. I took a slow breath, feeling the cold, hard weight of the manila envelope resting inside my silver clutch. I had the DNA results. I had the financial records. I had the complete medical history. I held the match that was going to burn their entire fantasy to ashes. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the bright light of the grand ballroom. The effect was immediate. The sharp clicking of my stiletto heels against the marble floor seemed to echo louder than the music. Conversations began to stall as people turned to look at me. The midnight blue Balmain gown commanded absolute attention. It was not just a dress, it was a declaration of war. The investors who knew me from my own discreet business dealings recognized me instantly and began whispering to each other. Dion was in the middle of shaking hands with a potential backer when his eyes darted across the room and locked onto mine. The fake, arrogant smile vanished from his face so quickly it was almost comical. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and terrified under the crystal lights. He dropped the investor's hand and frantically motioned toward the security guard standing near the ballroom doors. He snapped his fingers repeatedly, pointing at me with a shaking hand. Preston was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of scotch. He saw Dion panicking and followed his line of sight. When Preston saw me standing there looking like the owner of the world, his jaw tightened with supreme irritation. He still thought I was just the discarded foster kid. He still believed his law degree made him the most powerful person in the room. He set his glass down hard on the bar and marched purposefully across the ballroom floor, intercepting me before I could reach the center of the room. He stepped directly into my path, blocking my way. He tried to maintain a low voice to avoid drawing more attention, but his tone was laced with absolute venom. "What the hell are you doing here, Bianca?" he demanded, leaning down to try and intimidate me. "This is a private corporate event, and you are not on the guest list." I did not stop walking. I simply adjusted my pace, forcing him to step backward to avoid a collision. I told him to step aside before he embarrassed himself. Preston scoffed, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. He reached out and firmly wrapped his large hand around my bare upper arm, squeezing tightly. His grip was aggressive and meant to cause pain. "You are trespassing," he hissed, his breath smelling heavily of cheap scotch. "I am the legal counsel for this dealership, and I am telling you to leave right now before I have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs. You do not belong in a place like this." I stopped walking. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, and then I looked slowly up into his arrogant eyes. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. I just stared at him with a look of such absolute freezing contempt that he involuntarily loosened his grip. Before Preston could say another word, the general manager of the Grand Hotel rushed through the crowd. He was a distinguished older gentleman who had managed the property for 2 decades. Preston smiled a cruel, victorious smile, expecting the manager to call for backup and have me physically removed from the premises. "Mr. Davis, please have your security team remove this woman immediately," Preston commanded, puffing out his chest. "She is trespassing on a privately rented floor and harassing our guests." The general manager completely ignored Preston. He stepped right past the arrogant lawyer and stopped directly in front of me. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep professional respect that sent a ripple of absolute shock through the watching crowd. "Ms. Bianca," he said, his voice clear and deferential, "I apologize for the delay. Your private VIP suite is fully prepared, and our staff is standing by to assist you with anything you might require this evening." Preston stood frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain struggled to process the interaction. He looked from the bowing manager to me, completely bewildered. "What are you talking about?" Preston stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. "She does not have a suite here. She is a trespasser." I slowly brushed Preston's hand off my arm as if brushing away a piece of filthy lint. I looked him dead in the eyes, making sure my voice carried clearly to the wealthy investors watching our exchange. "I bought this hotel yesterday, Preston," I said, my tone perfectly flat and devastatingly calm. "Take your hand off my property." The color vanished from Preston's face. His arrogant posture collapsed instantly. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was standing in a building that I owned, threatening me with police action while his brother-in-law begged for pennies in my ballroom. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply took another stumbling step backward, retreating into the crowd like a beaten dog. Across the room, Dion was watching the entire exchange. He was sweating profusely now, pulling at the collar of his ridiculous velvet tuxedo. He saw Preston retreat and knew his physical intimidation tactics had failed. The wealthy investors were watching him, waiting for an explanation. The entire energy of the room had shifted, and Dion could feel his fake empire slipping through his fingers. He decided to play his final desperate card. He grabbed a microphone from the podium near the string quartet and tapped it loudly, calling for everyone's attention. The music stopped abruptly. The crowd turned toward the small stage. Dion wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and forced a massive shaking smile onto his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming tonight," he announced, his voice echoing too loudly through the speakers. "We are here to celebrate the future. We are here to talk about legacy and family and building something that will last for generations. My beautiful son Trey is the reason I push so hard. He is the bloodline of this dealership." Brittany held Trey up higher, smiling for the crowd, while Ruby clapped her hands loudly from the back of the room, shouting praises to the Lord. "But we cannot build the future alone," Dion continued, his voice pitching higher with desperate enthusiasm. "We need strong partners. We need visionary leaders who understand the value of what we are creating here. That is why I am so incredibly honored to announce that we have secured the ultimate partnership tonight." The crowd murmured with polite interest. The local developers leaned in, waiting for the big reveal. Dion gripped the microphone stand like it was a life preserver. "We have an anonymous representative here tonight from one of the most powerful financial entities in the country," Dion shouted, his face flushed with manic hope. "They have reviewed our books, they have seen our potential, and they are here tonight to finalize a massive capital injection into our dealership. Please put your hands together and give a warm Atlanta welcome to the representative from B Holdings firm." The ballroom erupted into polite applause. Dion stood on the stage, looking out over the crowd, desperately searching for a man in a business suit to step forward and save his life. He clapped his hands, waiting for his savior to arrive. The room remained still. No one stepped forward from the crowd of investors. The applause slowly died down, replacing the celebratory atmosphere with a thick, uncomfortable silence. Dion looked around, his smile faltering as panic set back into his eyes. I stood at the back of the room, holding my silver clutch. I took a slow breath, feeling the absolute perfection of the moment. I stepped forward, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the marble floor once again. The crowd naturally parted for me, sensing the shift in gravity. I walked slowly down the center aisle, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. Dion watched me approach, his face contorted in confusion. He lowered the microphone, shaking his head as if trying to clear a hallucination. "What are you doing?" he hissed without the microphone, hoping only I could hear him. "Get back! This is not for you." I ignored his desperate whispering. I reached the bottom of the stage and placed my hand on the polished wooden railing. I gracefully walked up the short flight of stairs, the heavy velvet of my gown trailing behind me like liquid midnight. I stepped directly onto the stage, invading his sacred space. I walked right up to him, pulling the medical report, the financial audits, and the certified DNA results from my silver clutch. I reached out and calmly took the microphone right out of his trembling hand. I stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and prominent socialites who had gathered in the grand ballroom. The silence in the room was so absolute it felt heavy and suffocating, like the atmosphere just before a massive thunderstorm. Dion stood frozen just 2 feet away from me, his velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap theatrical costume rather than the attire of a successful businessman. The arrogant smile he had worn all evening completely dropped from his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He tried to reach for the microphone, but his hand was shaking so badly he simply let it fall back to his side, defeated by his own physical panic. I tapped the microphone once, ensuring the hotel sound system was perfectly calibrated to carry my voice to the very back of the massive room. I looked directly at the local real estate developers and angel investors who had been nodding along to Dion's fraudulent pitch just moments before. I introduced myself clearly and confidently as Bianca, the sole owner and chief executive officer of B Holdings firm. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. The anonymous venture capital entity they had all been eagerly waiting to meet was not a room full of faceless men in gray suits. It was the woman standing before them, wearing a $15,000 custom gown, looking completely untouchable. I kept my voice smooth and clinical, projecting absolute authority across the silent ballroom. I announced that my firm had conducted a thorough and exhaustive forensic review of the dealership Dion was desperately attempting to salvage tonight. I watched Dion's eyes widen in horror as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his thick skull. He realized his entire corporate structure had been systematically dismantled by the very person he thought he had successfully discarded in a hospital room. I spoke clearly into the microphone, stating that I had reviewed his pathetic proposal in its entirety. I told the room that not only was my firm firmly declining any investment in his crumbling empire, but as the primary holder of his commercial liens, I was publicly calling in every single one of his debts effective immediately. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and devastating to witness. The wealthy men who had been shaking his hand and drinking his cheap champagne just minutes ago immediately took a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from a sinking ship. They recognized a toxic financial asset when they saw one, and Dion had just become entirely radioactive. Dion opened his mouth to defend himself, but only a pathetic stammering sound came out. He looked wildly around the room, searching the faces of his former friends and colleagues for anyone who would throw him a lifeline. He found absolutely none. Instead, a loud, piercing scream shattered the remaining polite atmosphere of the gala. Ruby launched herself out of her front row seat, her massive silver church hat bobbing aggressively as she pointed a heavily manicured finger at the stage. She could not stand to watch her golden son be humiliated in front of the elite society she so desperately craved to join. She marched toward the steps, her face twisted in an ugly snarl of pure unhinged hatred. She screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a liar. Her shrill voice echoed harshly off the crystal chandeliers as she called me a bitter, jealous ex-wife who was just trying to ruin her successful son because he had finally found a real woman to give him a proper family. She turned to the crowd of investors, waving her arms frantically in the air. She begged them not to listen to a crazy, angry woman who came from nothing and had nothing to offer. She yelled that I was just a desperate foster kid making up elaborate stories because my husband had decided to upgrade to a much better life. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I did not need to lower myself to her chaotic level. I simply reached into my silver evening clutch and pulled out a small black remote control I had synchronized with the hotel audio-visual system earlier that afternoon. I pointed the remote directly at the control booth in the back of the room and pressed a single button with my thumb. The main lights in the ballroom immediately dimmed, plunging the room into dramatic cinematic shadow. The massive projector screen behind the stage suddenly roared to life, humming with power. A brilliant white light illuminated the faces of the shocked guests as a highly detailed financial document appeared 50 feet wide for everyone in the room to see clearly. I turned back to the microphone and smoothly narrated the presentation that was about to destroy their lives. I directed the audience's attention to the undeniable proof of Dion's absolute insolvency. The first slide displayed his actual corporate balance sheets, stripped of all the fraudulent accounting tricks he had used to secure his initial venues. The bold, red numbers proved beyond any doubt that his dealership was functionally bankrupt, operating at a massive monthly loss, and drowning in millions of dollars of unserviceable toxic debt. Dion let out a strangled, pathetic cry, burying his face in his shaking hands as his financial ruin was broadcast to the entire city elite. But I was nowhere near finished. I pressed the button on the remote again, and the screen transitioned to a new set of highly sensitive documents. These were the bank transfer logs I had intercepted from his private personal accounts. I highlighted a specific transaction, drawing a bright yellow digital circle around the origin and destination routing numbers so no one could possibly miss the connection. I calmly explained to the silent, captivated room that Dion was so desperate to make his payroll obligations on Friday that he required a massive illegal bailout just to keep his doors open for the weekend. The screen showed a crystal-clear, high-definition image of a wire transfer in the exact amount of $200,000. I read the origin account name aloud, letting the heavy words hang in the stale air of the ballroom. The money had been transferred directly from the Holy Redeemer Church Orphanage Fund straight into Dion's personal checking account. The ensuing chaos in the room was truly spectacular to witness. The group of older women from Ruby's church, who had been fawning over her outfit just minutes before, gasped in unison, pressing their hands to their mouths in horror. 3 prominent church elders, who had been invited to the gala as honored VIP guests, stood up from their tables in absolute outrage. One of the senior deacons, a tall, imposing man with a booming, authoritative voice, pointed furiously at Ruby, demanding an immediate explanation for the criminal theft displayed on the screen. The orphanage fund was sacred holy money. It was painstakingly compiled from the weekly tithes and small sacrifice donations of hardworking congregation members who genuinely believed they were helping vulnerable children find homes. Ruby had maliciously stolen from actual orphans just to protect a luxury car dealership and maintain her son's fake image of wealth. Ruby froze, her mouth hanging open as she stared up at the massive projection of her own criminal activity. The arrogant, righteous fire completely vanished from her eyes, replaced instantly by the cold, paralyzing grip of absolute terror. She clutched her chest, her manicured hands digging deeply into the expensive fabric of her dress. She began gasping for air, dramatically stumbling backward as the furious church elders converged on her table, blocking her escape. Her entire social standing, the pristine, flawless reputation she had aggressively cultivated over decades of Sunday services and elite choir practices, evaporated in a matter of seconds. Her closest church friends backed away from her, physically repulsed by the reality of her vile theft. She was no longer the respected matriarch of a successful, God-fearing family. She was a common brazen thief exposed in front of the very high society she worshipped and craved. She sank heavily into her chair, weeping hysterically, as the senior deacon loudly promised to call the federal authorities the very moment he walked out of the building. Dion stood frozen on the stage, watching his mother collapse under the crushing weight of her own corruption. He looked back at the massive screen displaying his fraudulent ledgers, and then he looked down at the disgusted, appalled faces of the wealthy investors who were now heading rapidly toward the exit doors, refusing to be associated with such a massive scandal. His carefully built empire was completely dead. His reputation was permanently obliterated. He had lost absolutely everything in the span of 5 agonizing minutes. The sheer totality of his devastating defeat seemed to snap something fragile deep inside his brain. The polished, smooth corporate facade he had maintained for years broke completely away, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered animal thrashing blindly in a trap. He realized he could never save his failing business. He realized he could never save his weeping mother from federal prison. The only single thing he had left in his shattered world was his desperate, burning desire to hurt me. He needed to prove to the remaining crowd that he was still a strong, dominant man. He needed to claim one final pathetic victory to salvage his completely shattered ego. He lunged violently across the stage, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He grabbed a spare microphone from a heavy metal stand near the string quartet, yanking the thick black cord so hard the heavy stand crashed loudly onto the polished floor. The audio feedback shrieked horribly through the massive speakers, causing several guests in the front row to wince and cover their ears. Dion did not care about the noise or the spectacle he was creating. He stomped heavily back to the center of the stage, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at my face. He screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with manic, unpredictable desperation. "You think you broke me," he bellowed, spit actually flying from his lips as he stared at me with pure, undiluted hatred. "You think freezing some bank accounts and putting some numbers on a big screen changes who I really am. You did not break me, Bianca." He turned his body and pointed wildly at Brittany, who was cowering near the dark edge of the stage, clutching little Trey tightly to her chest. The toddler was crying loudly now, completely terrified by the sudden loud noises and the overwhelming chaos filling the room. "I still have my legacy," Dion screamed, pacing back and forth across the wooden stage like a madman, completely losing his grip on reality. "I still have my strong bloodline. I built a real family with a real woman who actually knows her place. I have my beautiful son." He pointed aggressively at the crying boy, his chest heaving heavily as he tried to project absolute triumph through his complete and total ruin. "That is more than you could ever give me, you barren foster trash." The cruel, vile words echoed loudly through the cavernous ballroom, silencing the few remaining guests who had lingered to watch the drama unfold. The massive room held its collective breath, waiting anxiously to see exactly how the powerful billionaire woman in the midnight blue gown would respond to such a vicious, deeply personal public attack. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate insult wash completely over me, without leaving a single invisible mark. I did not flinch. I did not show even a fraction of an ounce of pain or humiliation. I simply looked down at Dayon, sweating and panting heavily on the stage, clinging desperately to a crying child he believed validated his entire worthless existence. I was finally about to give him exactly what he asked for. I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy metal microphone in my hand. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Every single pair of eyes was locked on me, waiting to see how I would react to Dion's vile, desperate insult. He stood panting, his chest heaving as he pointed at the crying toddler in Brittany's arms, claiming the boy was his ultimate legacy. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of pain. Instead, a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was a smile devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. It was the smile of an executioner. I raised my left hand, holding the small black remote control, and pressed the button one final time. The massive projector screen behind us flickered, and the financial documents disappeared. They were instantly replaced by a stark white medical file. It was highly magnified, the black text sharp and undeniable against the glowing background. It was a certified medical evaluation from a prominent Atlanta urologist, dated exactly 5 years ago. I had spent a small fortune having Marcus bypass hospital security protocols to acquire it. I lifted the microphone to my lips, my voice echoing through the cavernous room with chilling clarity. I told Dion to turn around and look at the screen. I told him to look very closely at the medical diagnosis he had hidden from me and from the rest of the world. Dion slowly turned his head, his arrogance completely draining away as he read the massive letters projected 20 feet high across the ballroom wall. The medical conclusion was highlighted in bright yellow marker for everyone to see. The words irreversible sterility glared back at him. The detailed report outlined a severe permanent medical condition that made it biologically impossible for Dion to ever father a child naturally. He had known this for 5 years. He had let me endure 4 agonizing rounds of IVF treatments, let me inject my body with hormones and cry over negative pregnancy tests, all while knowing he was the reason we could never conceive. The entire ballroom went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to crush bone. The wealthy investors, the church elders, and the hotel staff all stared at the screen in absolute shock. The lie Dion had built his entire new life upon was unraveling in real time. Dion dropped his arms, his hands shaking violently. The spare microphone he had grabbed earlier slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the wooden stage with a dull thud. He stumbled backward, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He turned his head slowly toward the side of the stage where Brittany was standing. Brittany was trembling uncontrollably. Her face was completely drained of all color, looking like a porcelain doll that was about to shatter. She pulled Trey tighter against her chest, trying to shield herself from the devastating truth that was now written on the wall behind her. Dion took a shaky step toward her, his voice barely a whisper but echoing in the absolute quiet of the room. He asked her what this was. He asked her how this was possible if the medical report was true. His brain was misfiring, unable to process the magnitude of the deception. He had thrown away an 11-year marriage for a legacy that did not biologically exist. I did not give Brittany the chance to invent another lie. I lowered the microphone and turned my back on Dion, leaving him to drown in his own pathetic confusion. I walked slowly down the short flight of stairs, descending from the stage with the same unhurried grace I had used to approach it. The midnight blue velvet of my gown swept softly against the steps. The crowd parted for me once again as I walked straight down the center aisle. I did not stop until I reached the front row where Preston and Ebony were sitting. Ebony was gripping the edge of her table, her eyes wide with shock as she tried to understand what was happening to her brother's life. Preston was sitting rigidly beside her, his face covered in a sheen of cold sweat. His arrogant smirk was gone entirely. He looked like a man who knew the executioner was coming directly for him. I stopped right in front of their table. I looked down at Preston, my expression completely devoid of mercy. I spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single word clearly. I told Dion, who was still standing paralyzed on the stage, that he could not have children. I let the words hang in the air, ensuring the reality of his sterile diagnosis was cemented in the minds of everyone present. Then I shifted my gaze, locking eyes with Preston. "But you know who can?" I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "Preston can." I reached into my silver clutch one last time and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the certified DNA test results. I did not hand it to him gently. I threw the heavy envelope directly onto Preston's chest. It hit him with a soft slap before sliding down onto his lap. I turned slightly, projecting my voice so Dion could hear the final devastating truth. I told Dion that Trey was not his son. I told him the child he had paraded around the room as the future of his empire belonged to Preston. I exposed the final sickening layer of their betrayal, stating clearly that his arrogant, racist brother-in-law had been sleeping with his cheap mistress for 3 solid years. The silence in the ballroom held for one impossible, agonizing second. The reality of the twisted family dynamic settled over the crowd. Dion had financed a luxury life for the woman who was sleeping with his sister's husband. He was raising the child of the man who despised him. Preston had been carrying on an affair right under Ebony's nose, using family gatherings and dealership events as a convenient cover for his absolute depravity. Then the silence broke. It did not just break, it shattered into absolute terrifying pandemonium. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like a violent rush of wind. Investors began grabbing their coats and rushing for the exits, desperate to escape the toxic fallout of this monumental family collapse. Ruby, who had been weeping in her chair, let out a horrific wailing sound, clutching her chest as she witnessed the final destruction of her golden child's life. Dion stood on the stage, his eyes rolling back slightly as his knees buckled. He dropped to the floor of the stage, completely broken, unable to support the weight of his own profound humiliation. The legacy he had sacrificed everything for was a biological lie orchestrated by the two people he trusted most. But the true explosion happened right in front of me. Ebony sat frozen for a fraction of a second, staring at the manila envelope resting on Preston's lap. She looked at her husband, the successful corporate lawyer who had promised her a life of loyalty and prestige. She saw the guilt written plainly across his sweating, terrified face. She realized that every late night at the office, every mysterious weekend golf trip, and every lingering glance at family barbecues had been a calculated deception. A primal, ear-splitting shriek tore from Ebony's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated female rage. She did not attack Preston. She turned her violent gaze directly toward the stage where Brittany was still standing, frozen in terror, holding the toddler. Ebony kicked her chair backward with such force it crashed into the table behind them, shattering crystal champagne flutes across the floor. She lunged forward, moving with a terrifying speed. She completely ignored me, pushing past my shoulder as she scrambled toward the stage stairs. Brittany screamed a high-pitched sound of absolute panic. She turned to run, but her high heels caught on the edge of the stage curtain. Ebony scrambled up the stairs like a predator, her expensive evening gown tearing as her knee caught on the wooden railing. I stood back and watched the chaos unfold, my face a mask of cold satisfaction. The security guards who were supposed to protect the event were too stunned by the rapid succession of revelations to react in time. The general manager of the hotel stood near the entrance watching me for a signal, but I simply offered a slight shake of my head. I wanted them to feel every single second of this destruction. Ebony reached the stage and threw herself at Brittany. The two women collided in a tangle of sequins and screaming. Trey was safely pulled away by one of the horrified string quartet musicians just before Ebony tackled Brittany to the floor. They rolled across the polished wood, scratching and clawing at each other. Ebony was shrieking curses, hitting Brittany with her bare hands, demanding to know how she could sleep with her husband. Brittany was sobbing and trying to protect her face, her cheap extensions being ripped from her scalp. Preston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He jumped up from the table, his chair clattering to the floor, and rushed toward the stage to pull his wife off his mistress. He was shouting for everyone to calm down, but his voice was completely lost in the roaring chaos of the ballroom. Dion was still on his knees watching his sister attack the woman he thought loved him over the child he thought was his. He looked completely hollowed out, a shell of the arrogant man who had stood on my porch and told me I was easily replaceable. He was weeping now, tears streaming down his face as his entire universe burned to ash around him. I turned my back on the stage, the sounds of screaming and shattered glass echoing behind me. I had delivered exactly what I promised. I had taken his money, his reputation, his mother, his legacy, and his pride. I had surgically dismantled his entire life and left him with absolutely nothing. I walked slowly toward the exit, my posture perfect, my head held high. The remaining investors and hotel staff parted for me, treating me with a mixture of profound respect and absolute terror. They knew they had just witnessed a masterclass in vengeance. They knew the woman in the midnight blue gown was not someone to be crossed ever again. Marcus was waiting by the main doors, holding my velvet evening wrap. He draped it carefully over my shoulders, his face as stoic as ever. He did not ask any questions. He simply guided me toward the waiting elevator away from the wreckage of the Wilson family. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of Ebony's furious shrieking and Dion's pathetic sobbing, I looked at my reflection in the polished brass doors. I was no longer the discarded foster kid. I was no longer the obedient wife who endured endless fertility treatments and emotional neglect. I was the architect of my own empire. I rode the elevator up to my penthouse, leaving the ashes of their lives far below me, ready to return to my daughter and the beautiful, untouchable life I had built for us. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered the absolute second the certified DNA results hit Preston's chest. The undeniable proof that Preston had fathered the child Dion claimed as his own sent a shockwave of pure kinetic violence through the room. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching with cold satisfaction as the carefully constructed illusion of the Wilson family dynasty disintegrated into microscopic dust. Dion stood paralyzed on the stage, his eyes darting frantically from the medical records projected on the massive screen to the terrified faces of Brittany and Preston. The realization that his entire legacy was a biological lie orchestrated by the two people he trusted most finally snapped the last fragile thread of his sanity. A guttural animalistic roar ripped from his throat. It was not a shout of anger, but the raw sound of a man who had been completely hollowed out. He did not care about the wealthy investors, the church elders, or the hotel staff watching in absolute horror. He launched his massive frame off the wooden stage, hurtling through the air directly toward Preston. Preston was desperately trying to peel Ebony off of Brittany, but he never saw Dion coming. Dion tackled Preston with terrifying, reckless force. The impact lifted the arrogant corporate lawyer completely off the floor and sent them both crashing backward into the towering crystal champagne pyramid. The destruction was spectacular. Hundreds of expensive glasses shattered simultaneously, sending a glittering, deadly wave of shards and vintage liquor cascading across the polished marble floor. The deafening crash drowned out the screams of the remaining guests. Preston, the untouchable defense attorney who believed his race and status made him a god among insects, was left bleeding and weeping among the broken crystal. His bespoke suit, the one he wore like armor, was shredded and soaked in alcohol. He curled into a pathetic ball on the wet floor, begging for someone to help him. But there was no mercy left in that room. Ebony had completely lost her mind upon learning of her husband's 3-year affair with her brother's mistress. The humiliation of being paraded around while her husband slept with Brittany broke her completely. She abandoned her attack on Brittany and turned her full primal rage onto Preston. She stood over his bleeding form, gripping the heavy leather strap of her designer purse. She swung the bag down with brutal force, the solid brass hardware cracking repeatedly against Preston's face and shoulders. She screamed until her voice was hoarse, cursing him for every lie, every late night at the office, and every single betrayal. The mighty Preston was left sobbing on the floor, trying weakly to shield his face from his wife's relentless assault. Over the sounds of shattering glass and violent shrieks, a new noise began to echo from the streets below. It started as a distant wail and rapidly multiplied into a deafening chorus of sirens. The flashing red and blue lights reflected violently against the massive windows of the ballroom. I checked the slim silver watch on my wrist, noting that my timing was absolutely flawless. I had not just invited the city's elite angel investors to this pathetic gala to watch Dion fail. I had also sent a comprehensive, highly encrypted dossier containing every piece of Dion's fraudulent financial history directly to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I gave them the exact location and the precise time to execute their warrants. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom burst open with explosive force. A dozen federal agents swarmed into the room, moving with swift tactical precision. Their badges caught the light from the chandeliers as they descended upon the chaotic scene. The agents shouted loud commanding orders, physically pulling the brawling family members apart. Two large agents grabbed Dion by the shoulders, twisting his arms roughly behind his back. Dion struggled wildly, his face contorted in blind rage, but they easily overpowered him. They slammed him face first onto the champagne-soaked marble, pressing his cheek into the broken glass. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed clearly over the noise. An agent firmly read him his rights, listing the specific charges of federal wire fraud embezzlement and multiple counts of forging official documents. Dion finally stopped fighting. He lay completely motionless on the floor, tears streaming down his face, as he realized his empire was officially dead and he was going to federal prison. Amidst the swirling chaos of federal agents securing the room and paramedics rushing in to treat Preston, I noticed a shadow moving quietly along the perimeter of the ballroom. Brittany was using the violent distraction of the brawl to make her final desperate move. Her sequined dress was torn, and her blonde hair was a tangled mess, but her survival instincts had completely taken over. She was clutching a crying Trey tightly to her chest, trying to slip unnoticed toward the rear service exit. Slung heavily over her shoulder was a large black canvas duffel bag. She was a survivor of the streets, and she knew exactly when a game was over. She had raided the temporary coat check room, emptying the lockbox where the event staff had collected the mandatory cash donations Dion had forced upon his guests. She was trying to steal whatever cash she could carry and vanish into the night. She reached the heavy metal doors of the service corridor, looking over her shoulder one last time before pushing her way into the dim hallway. She believed she had successfully escaped the fallout. She was completely wrong. Marcus had anticipated every single variable, and his private security detail was waiting quietly in the shadows. Three massive men in dark suits stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall across the exit. Brittany stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes wide with fresh terror. She tried to turn back, but Marcus himself stepped out from behind her, smoothly plucking the heavy duffel bag of stolen cash from her shoulder without a single word. I had no intention of letting an innocent child suffer in the care of a desperate, opportunistic criminal. I had alerted Child Protective Services earlier that evening, providing them with substantial evidence of Brittany's unstable living conditions and the violent environment she routinely subjected her son to. Two social workers, accompanied by a uniformed police officer, stepped into the service corridor. They calmly but firmly removed the screaming toddler from Brittany's arms, assuring her the child would be placed in a safe temporary environment, while the authorities sorted out the criminal charges she was about to face for attempted grand theft. Brittany fell to her knees in the empty hallway, sobbing hysterically, as the only leverage she had ever possessed in her life was carried away from her forever. I turned my attention back to the main ballroom, ready to take my final exit. The room was a masterpiece of total devastation. Federal agents were hauling Dion to his feet, marching the broken man toward the exit doors. Paramedics were loading Preston onto a stretcher, his face wrapped in bloody gauze, while police officers questioned a catatonic Ebony who sat staring blankly at the ruined floor. And then I saw Ruby. She was sitting on the floor in the exact center of the room, completely surrounded by the glittering wreckage of the Champagne Pyramid. The beautiful, expensive dress she had worn to show off her fake wealth to her church friends was soaked in alcohol and stained with dirt. Her massive silver hat had fallen off, resting upside down in a puddle of spilled wine. The proud, arrogant woman who had constantly told me I was cursed and unworthy was now sitting in broken glass like a beggar. The realization that she had stolen from an orphanage fund to finance this disaster had completely broken her spirit. She saw me standing near the stage preparing to leave. She dragged herself across the slick marble floor, leaving a wet trail of fabric behind her. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands. She grabbed the heavy velvet hem of my midnight blue gown, clutching the fabric as if it were her only salvation in the world. She looked up at me, her face completely streaked with running mascara and tears. "Bianca," she sobbed, her voice cracking and hoarse. "Please forgive me. The Lord teaches us to forgive. I was blind and foolish. Please do not let them send me to prison. I am an old woman. Please have mercy on us." She was begging the barren foster trash to save her from the consequences of her own horrific greed. She expected the quiet, obedient girl she had bullied for years to magically reappear and offer her grace. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no sorrow. The well of my empathy for the Wilson family had run completely dry a long time ago. She was just a pathetic obstacle that had finally been removed from my path. I did not speak to her. I did not offer her a single word of comfort or condemnation. I simply stepped backward, pulling the rich velvet fabric of my dress firmly out of her weak, grasping hands. I turned my back on the Wilson family for the very last time, leaving Ruby weeping alone on the floor. I walked through the grand double doors of the hotel lobby, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air of Atlanta. The street was lined with flashing police cruisers and a massive crowd of local reporters and paparazzi who had caught wind of the spectacular high society raid. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, a sea of camera flashes erupted, illuminating the darkness with brilliant, explosive light. Reporters shouted questions about the fraud and the arrests, but I ignored them all. I did not cover my face or shy away from the attention. I adjusted my sunglasses against the blinding glare of the cameras and walked smoothly toward my waiting car, perfectly composed, completely victorious, and totally free. 3 weeks had passed since the spectacular implosion at the Grand Gala, and the dust was finally beginning to settle over the ruined remains of the Wilson family empire. The destruction I had carefully orchestrated and unleashed upon them was absolute and comprehensive, leaving absolutely no corner of their arrogant lives untouched by severe consequences. Preston was the very first to experience the true crushing weight of the fallout. He had spent his entire adult life building an untouchable image as a high-powered corporate defense attorney, strutting through the elite circles of Atlanta, looking down his nose at everyone he deemed beneath his prestigious status. That massive arrogance was completely shattered the very morning after the gala. The senior partners at his highly respected law firm had obviously seen the viral cell phone videos of him bleeding and crying in a massive puddle of expensive champagne, while his furious wife beat him mercilessly with her designer purse. Worse, they had seen the undeniable documentary proof that he had fathered a secret child with his own brother-in-law's cheap mistress. The firm moved with swift, ruthless corporate efficiency to protect their brand. They immediately triggered the strict morality clause buried deep in his partnership contract and fired him without a single ounce of hesitation. He was not even allowed to return to the gleaming glass building to clean out his massive corner office. The building's security guards simply packed his personal belongings into a cheap brown cardboard box and mailed it to him. But losing his prestigious career was only the very beginning of Preston's dark nightmare. Ebony filed for divorce the very next morning, and she fought him with a level of cold, vindictive fury that even I had to silently admire. She hired the absolute most vicious and expensive divorce attorney in the entire state and systematically stripped Preston of every single financial asset he possessed. She took the luxury house, the massive investment portfolios, the imported luxury cars, and even his pristine vintage watch collection. Because of his highly publicized infidelity and the horrific, twisted nature of his familial betrayal, the family court judge showed him absolutely no mercy during the rapid proceedings. Preston was left completely destitute, forced to move into a tiny, damp studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. The powerful, arrogant man, who used to casually mock my foster care upbringing, was now sleeping on a cheap, bare mattress on the floor, weeping softly into his shaking hands as he realized he had permanently lost his career, his wealth, and his dignity, all because of his own vile biological betrayal. While Preston was being systematically eviscerated in divorce court, his mother Ruby was facing her own horrific descent into personal hell. The Holy Redeemer Church Orphanage Fund was not just a simple bank account. It was a sacred trust, built on the small weekly sacrifices and hard-earned tithes of devout working-class congregation members. When the furious church elders confirmed the irrefutable banking proof I had displayed on the projector screen, their righteous anger was truly biblical. Ruby was summoned before the entire congregation on a packed Sunday morning. She was forced to stand alone at the main altar, not as the proud, respected matriarch she had always aggressively pretended to be, but as a common brazen thief. The senior deacon read her extensive financial crimes aloud to the silent, shocked church, detailing exactly how she had maliciously siphoned $200,000 of sacred orphan money to illegally bail out her worthless son's failing car business. The public shame was absolute and completely suffocating. The older women who used to blindly fawn over her expensive custom outfits and elaborate church hats now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She was formally and publicly excommunicated from the church, stripped of all her elite choir titles, and permanently banished from the only community she had spent decades trying to control and dominate. To avoid being sent directly to federal prison for felony grand larceny, Ruby was forced to make a desperate, humiliating plea deal with the local authorities. She had to immediately sell her pristine, immaculate suburban home to pay back every single penny of the embezzled funds before the end of the month. The beautiful house she loved more than her own children was rapidly liquidated in a massive public estate sale. She lost her heavy antique furniture, her expensive crystal collections, and her entire carefully fabricated fake identity. Left with absolutely nothing and completely cut off by her former high society friends, Ruby had to find a desperate way to simply survive. She was forced to take the only menial job that would immediately hire an elderly, disgraced woman with a pending felony record. The arrogant woman, who had tormented me for years about my lack of pedigree and social standing, was now working full-time as a basic cashier at a greasy 24-hour fast food restaurant located right off the busy interstate highway. She was forced to wear a hideous, stiff polyester uniform and a ridiculous paper hat, standing on her badly aching feet for 9 grueling hours a day while breathing in the heavy, suffocating smell of cheap frying oil. The absolute worst moments of her miserable new existence occurred when members of her former church congregation would happen to stop in for a quick meal. They would pull their cars up to the drive-through window or walk up to the main cash register and clearly see their former beloved sister Ruby wiping down the sticky plastic counters with a dirty gray rag. Her expensive manicures were completely gone, replaced by ugly grease burns, rough calluses, and broken nails. She would have to look down at the dirty linoleum floor, completely humiliated and broken, as she handed them their cheap-wrapped food and counted out their exact change. Her massive pride was completely obliterated ground into fine dust beneath the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But the most profound and devastating ruin was reserved exclusively for Dion. The stern federal agents, who had swarmed the hotel ballroom, had dragged him roughly away in heavy steel handcuffs, leaving him to sit alone in a cold, sterile concrete holding cell, while his entire world collapsed around him. He was eventually released on a massive bail bond secured by a shady local bondsman, but his temporary physical freedom was nothing more than a cruel, mocking illusion. The federal prosecutor was aggressively building an airtight slam dunk case against him for systemic wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and multiple counts of forging official financial documents. He was looking straight down the barrel of a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 agonizing years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. His entire dealership empire was officially dead and buried. The massive corporate banks had legally seized the commercial property, padlocking the heavy glass doors and rapidly auctioning off the remaining vehicle inventory to recover the millions of dollars in toxic, unserviceable debt he had foolishly accumulated. His personal bank accounts and hidden offshore funds were completely frozen by government order. He had absolutely no money left to hire a decent aggressive defense attorney, forced instead to rely on a severely overworked public defender who told him point blank during their very first brief meeting that he was going straight to prison and should strongly consider pleading guilty. And the very people he had maliciously sacrificed his 11-year marriage to protect had abandoned him immediately. Brittany, the woman he boldly claimed was a real woman who knew how to build a lasting legacy, had vanished into thin air the very second she realized the endless supply of money was completely gone. After Child Protective Services had temporarily taken little Trey away to ensure his physical safety during the massive criminal investigation, Brittany had vividly shown her true colors. She did not stick around to fight the legal system for her so-called family. She hastily packed whatever cheap, tight clothes she had left in her closet, scraped together enough loose cash for a Greyhound bus ticket, and fled the state entirely without leaving a single note behind. She did not care about Dion, and apparently, she did not care enough to fight for a child that she knew was not biologically his anyway. The absolute biological truth that Trey actually belonged to Preston had completely fractured Dion's fragile mind. He had willingly thrown away a deeply loyal marriage to a woman who had genuinely loved him all for a fake imaginary legacy and a stolen child. He was utterly alone, sitting in a dark, dingy, cheap motel room on the outskirts of town that smelled faintly of sour mildew and stale cigarette smoke. He had absolutely no family left to turn to for comfort. His mother was busy frying potatoes in absolute disgrace, and his sister was completely traumatized and consumed by her own ruined marriage. His cell phone never rang anymore. His former wealthy business friends and drinking buddies had completely blocked his number, erasing him from their elite social circles, as if he had a highly contagious terminal disease. He was a transparent, hollow ghost trapped in a rotting physical shell, just waiting for the federal government to finally come and lock him away in a steel cage for the next decade of his miserable life. The heavy, suffocating weight of his impending doom finally drove him to a state of absolute mindless desperation. He sat on the sagging edge of the deeply stained motel mattress, staring blankly down at the thick black plastic of the electronic ankle monitor, strapped tightly around his lower left leg. A small green light blinked steadily, indicating that the local authorities knew exactly where he was at all times. The heavy plastic device emitted a soft, rhythmic beeping sound. Every few minutes, a constant psychological torture serving to remind him that he was already a prisoner long before the trial even began. He looked out the dirty, cracked window of the motel room, watching a massive, violent rainstorm aggressively sweeping across the dark city skyline. Heavy thunder cracked loudly, shaking the cheap, thin glass panes in their wooden frames. He had absolutely no money left for a taxi or a rideshare. His premium credit cards were completely useless blocks of dead plastic. The bank had repossessed his luxury cars weeks ago, leaving him entirely stranded. He had nothing left in his shattered world but the desperate burning realization that there was only one single person left in the entire city who possessed the immense power and the unlimited financial resources to save him from a dark decade behind thick iron bars. He had to throw himself completely at my mercy. He put on a thin, worn-out windbreaker jacket that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing heavy downpour and stepped out into the brutal, violent storm. He began to walk. He walked step after agonizing step through the dark, deeply flooded streets of the city. The freezing rain hammered down relentlessly on his bare head, soaking his cheap, thin clothes until they clung heavily to his shivering, shaking frame. The expensive imported Italian leather shoes he was wearing were never meant for this kind of brutal physical punishment. They quickly became heavily waterlogged, the fine leather stretching and the thin soles beginning to peel apart entirely as he dragged his numb feet through deep, freezing puddles of muddy street water. The storm was absolutely relentless, showing him the exact same lack of mercy and compassion he had callously shown me when he handed me those divorce papers in the sterile hospital room. He walked for 7 grueling, agonizing miles. His leg muscles ached horribly. His lungs burned with the cold, damp air, and the freezing chill seeped deep into his very bones. The heavy electronic ankle monitor continued to beep a steady, mocking rhythm, accompanying the wet, slapping sound of his ruined, expensive shoes hitting the flooded pavement. Finally, after hours of pure physical and mental agony, he saw the towering wrought iron gates of my private estate looming in the dark, rainy distance. The massive estate was entirely surrounded by high, thick stone walls, topped with advanced security cameras and sensitive motion sensors, making it a completely impenetrable fortress that I had built and secured with my own hands. Dion staggered the last few painful yards, his exhausted legs giving out completely as he crashed heavily against the thick, cold iron bars of the main gate. The freezing, violent rain washed fiercely over his face, mixing seamlessly with his hot tears of absolute, total desperation. He gripped the cold, wet metal of the security gate exactly like a drowning man desperately clinging to a fragile piece of floating driftwood. His bare hands were completely numb, raw, and shaking violently from the freezing cold. He slowly lifted a trembling, wrinkled finger and pressed the heavy brass button of the secure electronic intercom, his chest heaving heavily as he stared directly into the unblinking red lens of the security camera, waiting desperately in the freezing rain for the powerful, untouchable woman he had completely destroyed to throw him one single pathetic lifeline. The heavy brass button was cold under his trembling finger as he pressed it again and again. The red light of the security camera blinked rhythmically in the darkness, cutting through the torrential rain that was washing away the very last traces of Dion Wilson. He stood there panting, his lungs burning as he stared into the small glass lens. He knew she was watching. He knew the massive security system of this impenetrable fortress was feeding high-definition video directly into the warm, dry sanctuary where his ex-wife now lived like a queen. His wet thumb kept slipping off the slick metal of the intercom panel. "Please," he croaked, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the violent storm. "Please answer me." The intercom crackled slightly, a sharp burst of static that made Dion jump. He grabbed the thick iron bars of the gate with both hands, pressing his wet face against the cold metal. "Bianca," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure pathetic desperation. "Bianca, please, I know you are in there. I know you can hear me." The only answer was the relentless pounding of the freezing rain against the pavement. His leg muscles finally gave out entirely. He collapsed onto his bruised knees, splashing down into a deep puddle of muddy water right outside the massive gate. He did not care about his ruined clothes or his destroyed dignity. He had absolutely nothing left to protect. He tilted his head back, letting the heavy rain wash over his face as he screamed into the empty storm. "I lost everything, Bianca," he wailed, sobbing loudly like a terrified, abandoned child. "They took the business. They took the bank accounts. My mother is gone and ruined. Brittany took the cash and ran away. Preston lied to me. They all lied to me. You were the only one who ever told me the truth. Please forgive me. I was blind and I was so stupid." He crawled closer to the gate, his raw, numb fingers gripping the bottom bars. He needed a new angle. He was a salesman, and he desperately needed to close the ultimate deal to save his life. He needed to appeal to the one thing he thought could magically soften her heart. Please let me see Arya, he begged, his voice growing increasingly hysterical. She is my daughter. She is my only true legacy left. I have nothing else in this world but her. Please let me be a father to my little girl. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever papers you want. Just let me see my family. He babbled uncontrollably into the night, mixing sad apologies with pathetic excuses. He blamed his mother for poisoning his mind against her. He blamed Preston for making him feel inadequate and weak. He blamed the entire world for his own terrible, selfish choices. He completely ignored the fact that he was wearing a heavy federal ankle monitor that was currently tracking his every miserable movement, flashing its green light through the muddy water. He just kept screaming Arya's name into the dark, desperately hoping that the biological connection he had so callously discarded in a sterile hospital room would magically serve as his get-out-of-jail-free card. For 10 agonizing minutes, Dion remained on his hands and knees, weeping into the mud. The freezing chill had seeped so deeply into his bones that he could barely feel his extremities. He was just about to give up and lie down in the freezing street to wait for the federal marshals to eventually come and track his monitor. Then a deep, mechanical hum vibrated through the wet pavement beneath him. A brilliant array of high-powered LED security lights suddenly flooded the driveway, banishing the dark shadows and illuminating the heavy iron gates. Dion gasped, shielding his eyes from the blinding bright glare. The massive iron barriers gave a loud metallic click and slowly began to slide open, smoothly retracting along their hidden tracks. Dion stared in absolute awe as a figure emerged from the long, perfectly manicured driveway. Bianca stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the pool of bright security light. The contrast between the two of them was jarring and almost cinematic in its sheer brutal reality. Dion was kneeling in the mud, shivering violently, his clothes torn and soaked through with freezing, dirty rainwater. He looked exactly like a feral stray animal begging for scraps. Bianca looked like an absolute goddess. She was glowing, radiating a profound internal peace and an untouchable quiet power. She was not wearing a sharp revenge dress or heavy, intimidating makeup. She was dressed in elegant, casual loungewear, wearing a thick, luxurious cream-colored cashmere sweater and soft silk trousers that draped perfectly over her figure. She looked completely relaxed and entirely at home in the massive empire she had built from scratch. Securely nestled in her arms, wrapped tightly in a plush, heated pink blanket, was Arya. The baby was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in a gentle, peaceful rhythm, completely undisturbed by the raging storm or the pathetic loud cries of the broken man kneeling in the mud. Bianca was flanked by two massive security guards. One was Marcus, his face a familiar mask of absolute stoic focus. He and the other guard stepped forward in perfect synchronization, holding two massive black golf umbrellas high over Bianca's head to ensure not a single drop of freezing rain could touch her or the sleeping child in her arms. Dion let out a strangled, pathetic gasp as he looked at the daughter he had brutally rejected. Arya had grown so much since that terrible day in the hospital. She was beautiful and perfect and completely out of his reach. He tried to stand up, but his frozen legs absolutely refused to support him. He stayed on his knees, dragging himself forward through the muddy puddle until he was hovering just inches from the invisible property line separating the public street from Bianca's private estate. The two security guards immediately shifted their stance, resting their hands casually on their heavy utility belts, making it silently and abundantly clear that if Dion moved even one fraction of an inch across that property line, they would physically break him into pieces. "Please, Bianca," Dion cried, reaching out his dirty, shaking hands toward the dry, illuminated sanctuary where she stood. "She is my daughter. Let me hold her. Just for a minute. Please let me hold my baby. I am a changed man. I see clearly now. I know what really matters in life. I need my family. I need you." Bianca did not smile. She did not frown. She did not look at him with hatred or vindictive triumph. She looked down at the broken weeping man kneeling in the dirt and felt absolutely zero emotion. The deep well of pain and anger that had fueled her survival for the past year was completely empty. There was no rage left for Dion Wilson. There was not even sadness. There was only a profound clinical pity. She looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, a tragic documentary she happened to be casually watching on a television screen. He meant absolutely nothing to her. He was merely a ghost haunting a life she no longer lived. Bianca held Arya a little closer to her chest, protecting the child's peaceful sleep from the cold, damp air. She looked directly into Dion's wild, bloodshot eyes. Her voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly through the heavy rain, steady and absolute. "1 hour after she was born, you refused to touch her," she said, her tone completely flat and factual. "You stood in that hospital room while I was still bleeding, and you refused to even look at her. You told me you already had a son. You told me to remember that moment." Dion's mouth opened in silent horror as his own cruel, unforgivable words were thrown directly back into his face. He remembered that day perfectly. He remembered the arrogant certainty he had felt when he walked out of that hospital room, believing he was moving toward a brilliant, wealthy future with Brittany and a fake legacy child. He realized in that exact terrifying second that he had completely destroyed his own life with his own hands. There was no one else to blame. He had literally thrown away a fortune and a family for an illusion. Bianca took a slow, deliberate step backward, completely removing herself from his physical proximity. She stepped safely behind the heavy metal track of the iron gate, retreating into the absolute security of her impenetrable fortress. I remembered, she said, her voice completely devoid of mercy. "Goodbye, Dion." She did not wait to see his reaction. She simply turned her back on him and began walking slowly up the long, illuminated driveway. Marcus and the other guard fell perfectly into step beside her, keeping the massive umbrellas positioned to shield her from the stormy night. Behind her, the heavy iron gates began to slide shut with a loud, mechanical grinding sound. Dion threw himself forward, crashing against the closing bars. He screamed her name over and over again, his voice completely tearing with the sheer agony of his absolute final loss. He clawed frantically at the wet, slippery metal, screaming for Arya, screaming for his mother, screaming for a life that was permanently dead. Bianca did not look back. Not even once. She listened to the sounds of his desperate wailing slowly fade as the massive gates locked firmly into place, sealing him outside in the freezing rain where he truly belonged. She walked up the gentle slope of the wide paved driveway, the warm golden lights of her massive, beautiful mansion glowing welcomingly in the dark distance. The rain continued to beat heavily against the umbrellas, but she felt entirely safe and protected. She looked down at Arya, who shifted slightly in her sleep, curling her tiny warm hand around the soft, luxurious fabric of Bianca's cashmere sweater. Bianca smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that radiated from the deepest part of her soul. The storm raged violently outside the high stone walls of her estate, but inside her world, it was perfectly quiet and safe. She had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. She had systematically dismantled the greedy, terrible people who had tried to bury her. She had secured a flawless, untouchable future for her daughter. The executioner was finally retired. She was just a mother now, a powerful, fiercely independent woman who had successfully navigated through the fires of hell and built an entire majestic empire from the ashes. She walked smoothly through the heavy wooden front doors of her sanctuary, leaving the cold, dark world and Dion Wilson permanently behind her. True worth is never defined by those who repeatedly belittle you, even if they happen to share your blood. The ultimate takeaway is that genuine family is built on mutual respect, not just genetics. When toxic relatives attempt to diminish your light and exploit your kindness, the greatest revenge is not found in seeking their destruction. Instead, it is found in building an extraordinarily successful, fiercely independent life entirely on your own terms. You are the sole architect of your destiny, and claiming your true power often requires gracefully walking away. Share your own empowering experiences of setting hard boundaries with toxic family members in the comments section below. And hit that subscribe button for more stories of strength survival and ultimate success.